Welcome, everyone. Thank you for braving the wilds of the streets of Berkeley, trying to find parking on graduation day. Welcome to our fourth and last Hippie Modernism Forum on creative communes. So we decided to have this forum to really look at something that was a really important counterculture moment, the Back to the Land movement, and try to figure out what it had to tell us, what its legacy was for us today. Of course, despite all of the stereotypes that surround the commune. The hippie commune was one of the most productive and influential legacies of the counterculture. There were about 10,000 rural communes by 1970, with about 750,000 people living in them, often nomadically, going from one to the next. It was the largest alternative kind of living movement in American history. And it provided not only collective shelter, but also workspace for innovative ventures. It's a kind of part of it that we don't always remember. Ventures including underground publishing, child daycare centers, so-called food conspiracies that popularized organic food and that resisted corporatized food retailing. Even enterprises like Community Memory, which is, you can see down on the exhibition floor, the world's first digital social media network, was created here in Berkeley in a commune that was sort of staffed by men who had a child care center. So that's another interesting hippie enterprise. So with artists increasingly priced out of the Bay Area boomtowns, we're wondering, could this counterculture legacy of communal living also provide a usable past from which to form new communities and geographies of creative production? So our Hippie Modernism Forum on Creative Communes is going to start with about a 15-minute presentation from each of our panelists. That'll be followed by a brief moderated conversation, and then we'll open it up to a open discussion with the audience. There will be a mic runner, so raise your hand to ask a question, and then we'll get a mic runner to you so everyone can hear your question. So to begin, it's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists, and I'm going to introduce all of them in the order of their presentation right now. First, we have Erin Elder. She's an independent curator of contemporary art, and she is guided by interests in land use, experimental collaboration, and non-traditional modes of expression. In 2009, Erin founded PLAND, P-L-A-N-D, that stands for Practice Liberating Art Through Necessary Dislocation. This was an experimental off-the-grid creative residency program in Tres Piedras, New Mexico. And her research-driven projects include a participatory retreat in Bolinas and also scholarly research on the Drop City Commune, which was published in the 2012 exhibition catalog West of Center, Art and the Counterculture Experiment in America. Our second participant, Ramón Sender Barayón, was a Bay Area composer and still is a visual artist and author. He co-founded the San Francisco Tape Music Center with Morton Subotnick in 1962, and with Stuart Brand and Ken Kesey, Sender co-produced the three-day Trips Festival in January 1966. That was an art and music happening that launched the hippie era, and you can see some of the artifacts of that downstairs in the Hippie Modernism show. Sender became the first resident at Lou Gottlieb's Morning Star Ranch. This was a crucial and important counterculture commune, and he then lived and worked at Wheeler Ranch and another intentional community in Occidental California, where he stayed until 1979. And Ramón is the author of novels, a visual arts catalog, and is now completing a new co-authored volume on rural Bay Area communes. And then we have Fritz Haeg, who's come to us from Northern California. He's an artist whose practice spans media from performance and dance to installation art, architecture, gardens, and ecology. And in 2014, Fritz purchased the Salmon Creek Farm. This was originally established in 1971 as a counterculture commune. Located in a redwood forest 2 miles from the Pacific, it's now the site of a long-term art project, a commune, farm, homestead, sanctuary, school hybrid shaped by an extended community of migratory comrades. So, Erin, will you please start for us? Thank you.
Thank you for not staging a riot in response to this talk. No, it's great to be here, and thank you, Greg, for the warm welcome and the invitation, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I'm really excited to be here and to speak with you today and learn about your projects, and most of all, thank you to all of you for being here, and thanks for listening. Did it work? Okay. It was a spring afternoon in 2006 when I walked into Haynes Gallery and encountered this image. Part of Joel Sternfeld's exhibition, Sweet Earth, Experimental Utopias in America, the caption on this image drew me in. It said, "Ruins of Drop City, Trinidad, Colorado, 1995. As a Coloradan who frequented the area, I had never heard of this intriguing place. At that point, I was enrolled in CCA's master's program in curatorial practice, and after some initial poking around, I decided to make Drop City the subject of my master's thesis. If you've seen the exhibition Hippie Modernism, you know a lot more about Drop City than I did when I began my research. By 2006, there was not a trace of Drop City where it had once been. No ruins, no signs, nothing. There was also very little public information about Drop City. I found a memoir, a few Denver Post articles from the 1960s, and a Wikipedia page. Through extensive interviews with the founders, called droppers, and a very generous gift of unpublished research from my friend Tom McCourt, I was able to piece together what I'm sure is only a fraction of the story. In brief, Drop City was a collection of experimental buildings made by artists. For the 7 years that it existed, Drop City was a creative testing ground for a group of people who worked hard, dreamed big, and brought laughter and bedazzlement to an otherwise hardscrabble existence. Drop City was the first of the rural hippie communes and is said to have inspired the construction of some 2,000, or according to Greg, 10,000 communes between 1965 and 1975. The original droppers, Joanne and Jean Bernofsky and Clark Rickert, met at University of Kansas in Lawrence. They bonded over creative experiments they called droppings that aimed to drop art into otherwise unwitting circumstances. For instance, on a busy downtown street, they left an elaboratively cooked breakfast on the sidewalk. Painted pebbles were dumped out of a second-story window onto passers-by. These actions were not unlike the happenings being staged in New York City by Alan Capro, John Cage, and the like. As part of this larger zeitgeist that aimed to dematerialize art, the droppers imagined a total artwork that collapsed art and life. They wanted to live art, to be art. This totalizing creative impulse is critical to understanding the nature and aims of Drop City. When the droppers graduated from KU, they left the creative safe space of university, faced with a nation at war with itself and abroad. In 1964, the US involvement in Vietnam was becoming more warlike, and revolution swept through the African continent, while the Beatles topped the Billboard charts and NASA released the first close-up pictures of the moon. The droppers describe a disgust with American society. To them, it was oppressive, compartmentalizing, violent, and unimaginative. They longed for a place to live and work as artists, free from politics, jobs, and social norms. To enact this rejection, they vowed to stop using sidewalks, stop using buildings, and they set out to build a new civilization from scratch. The droppers found a cheap piece of goat pasture outside of Trinidad, Colorado, a town scraping by after mining and railroad work had gone elsewhere. The droppers had no financial backing, no savings, and in step with Marshall McLuhan's notion of the media is the message, they committed themselves to creative scrounging. In this sense, Drop City was not so much made from scratch as it was made from scraps. Shelters were crafted from secondhand timber, cast-off bricks, night-harvested railroad ties, and especially chopped-out car tops. The droppers proudly took advantage of advanced obsolescence. They junked what the junkers junked. Having recently seen a lecture by Buckminster Fuller, the group was taken with his philosophies, and especially his architectural designs. They saw domes without corners or load-bearing columns and relatively easy to build as sculptural shelters that embodied their rejection of society's confines. The droppers built domes and developed what would later be called zomes. The place was constantly under construction, and many people came to be part of the creative labor. With these alternative buildings and Drop City's open door policies, domes quickly became the architectural vernacular of the counterculture. The totalizing lens of drop art was leveraged on every aspect of living. Trash was art, cooking was performance, and a ditch was something to be sculpted. But Drop City was also a place where tangible artworks were created. The group possessed an early video camera and talk about it as less of a tool for documentation and rather as a practice of expanded consciousness. They also made comic books, which is featured in the exhibition, issued a newsletter, and even produced a famous spinning painting. By 1967, they traveled the region giving wild performative lectures at community colleges and hosted drop-ins modeled after the love-ins and be-ins happening on both coasts. Drop City's Joy Festival of 1967 was designed as a stopover for those en route to San Francisco's Summer of Love. Thanks to publications like the Whole Earth Catalog and the increased mobility of young people, a countercultural network formed, and Drop City was a powerful node. Soon after a feature in Time magazine, Drop City blew its holding capacity and spiraled into kaleidoscopic decline. It was shut down in 1974 by local health authorities, and the land was eventually sold. My read on Drop City differs from those who visited or participated, and I'm sure I don't have the entire story. For me, Drop City was a model for creative and experimental collectivism that used art as a framework for enacting alternative lifestyle possibilities. Despite what some might deem failure, I see Drop City as a dynamic and important artistic attempt to do more than hang a painting. I am fascinated by the other communal experiments it spawned that in the following couple of years spread like wildfire across northern New Mexico and southern Colorado and still color the region's culture. I'm curious that these commune builders reportedly thought of the rural American Southwest as a kind of nowhere or frontier, a free zone, or what Timothy Leary called the outlaw area. How do these assumptions about this region fuel or misguide countercultural projects? How is this wave of ex-urban settlement regarded by those who already lived there? When artists or counterculturalists move to rural places, is it not a form of colonization or rural gentrification? Are they somehow less invasive than other new-coming outsiders? These are complex issues that I hope we can unpack during today's discussion. Now, for a different art project 40 years later and 150 miles to the southwest. I'll have a sip of water. While visiting some friends in New Mexico, my sister Nina and I became acquainted with the Taos Mesa. It is a 40-square-mile plateau that extends to the west of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains on both sides of the Rio Grande Gorge. It is a refuge for contemporary back-to-the-landers, many of whom live below the poverty line in campers, buses, or handmade homes. Water is hauled from elsewhere. Electricity is self-generated or forfeited altogether. We saw the Mesa as one of our country's remaining free zones and were enchanted by its rugged DIY community living off the grid and below the radar. With our friend Nancy Zastadil, we bought nearly an acre of unimproved land at auction. It cost the same price as a month of San Francisco rent. Our patch of mesa was void of amenities and trees. It was visible from the highway, but 30 miles from the nearest gas station. It was a rugged piece of land, but it was ours. There we created Planned, a residency program that between 2009 and 2013 supported the development of experimental and research-based projects. We found inspiration in a legacy of pioneers, entrepreneurs, homesteaders, artists, and perhaps even the droppers, who, through both radical and mundane activities, reclaimed and reframed a land-based notion of the American dream. Planned was sometimes mistakenly called P-Land or Plan D, both of which had a certain kind of sense to them, but however you pronounce it, the organization stood for a big idea: practice liberating art through necessary dislocation. Part alternative school, part laboratory, part homestead, part art studio. Planned was our solution for actively merging art and life. Over its 4.5-year lifespan, Planned hosted 14 residents, 6 school groups, a semester-long college-level practicum, and 3 multi-day work parties. We participated in multiple conferences, wrote articles, and received a number of impressive grants. What started as nothing quickly became a forerunner in a new wave of land-based art and life experiments. We saw Planned as a constantly evolving outpost where participants married survival-based goals with big ideas and non-traditional methods. As a direct confrontation to power, we hoped that Planned would provide a personal experience of the grid, or lack thereof. We came to understand how rare it is to be out of cell phone range, to be truly in the dark. We found bathing with a single cup of water to be a truly creative act. Shelter construction revealed the immense power of space, gravity, and triangles. As ad hoc as it sometimes felt, Planned proved to be a timely project that met a collective craving to live close to the earth, to dine by candlelight, to poop in a bucket, to experience the power of one's own body and mind, and to connect with other people who share those values. When Planned first began, residents lived in neighboring homesteads that we had been allowed to renovate and use. Eventually, we purchased a trailer and set it on the land as construction of the main house slowly lumbered along. Have you ever used a handsaw to cut through a railroad tie? If so, you know it takes a lot of time, but also muscle, persistence, and teamwork. Also labor-intensive was the salvage of materials. It took days to collect the tongue-and-groove floor donated from a gutted dance hall, and several more to stockpile the pro-panel roof cast off during a friend's remodel. We raised money for things like lumber and food, but it was a scrappy, low-budget existence. Residents applied through a competitive online process and came from all over the world. They worked hard at survival and site construction, but also conducted creative research. Sophie Meller made batteries with her urine. Mary Songa switched for water. Lee Montgomery recorded the low-frequency sounds of the power lines, to name just a few of the projects executed by Planned residents. Despite the climate-driven limitation of a 4-month building season, we collectively built a shade structure, a humanure system, an outhouse, a wood-burning sauna, a fire circle, a water filtration system, an adobe pit, and a bicycle-powered adobe mixer, approximately 1/5 of a 2-story, 800-square-foot house, as well as a series of temporary and site-responsive interventions. Oftentimes people ask why Planned took the form of a residency program. On one level, we were interested in alternative living and what it means to live or reside in a place. Add to this the fact that we are curators and artists. We think programmatically. I suppose we felt a need for an institutional framework, a name, a mission. Beyond the formalities, it was a mechanism for involving people we didn't already know, building a network of like minds. As co-directors of something we ourselves created, Planned was a platform for growing our young careers. In addition to making our own place, we had made our own jobs. Planned was an exercise in learning by doing. It was as humbling as it was empowering. It proved to us that a place is made by being in it, and that off-the-grid living is a full-time commitment. We learned a great deal about where our electricity comes from, where the moon rises at different times of year, that nails will not hold your roof on in a New Mexican windstorm, and that there are a few places as beautiful as the Taos Mesa. Perhaps most importantly, Planned was a testament to ourselves and to a few others that you can do something with nothing. When we set out to create Planned, we made a 3 to 5 year commitment. It was never something to do forever. As time wore on, we grew tired of commuting to town for low-paying service jobs and eventually landed good jobs in other parts of the state. At one point, our neighbors were made victim of some horrifying and inexplicable crimes, and suddenly issues of liability began to present themselves. Our growing organization became mired in taxes, grant reports, and constant correspondence. We were drowned by administration. We felt the work of managing the program had eclipsed and even contradicted our founding motivations. So in 2014, we dismantled the organization, and in 2016, through a strange and magical transaction, we transferred the land to someone else. It's still hard to believe that Planned is gone. Nina, Nancy, and I are still friends, and though we're not living off the grid, we're all still living self-made lives. Fast forward to next month, when the Museum of Capitalism will open to the public just a few miles from here. Organized by artists Andrea Steves and Timothy Firstnow, and involving nearly 100 others, the museum utilizes artworks to frame capitalism as a thing of the recent past. I'm honored to curate a show within the museum called American Domain. American Domain asserts that private property is, or was, essential to the reign of capitalism in America. Under capitalism, land is measured, marked, bounded, guarded, and owned. It is a commodity, a site of production, and oftentimes capitalism's dumping ground. I've pulled together a collection of videos, sculptures, and artworks that mimic or riff on the structures and forms of land ownership and address the performance of making property private. The works juxtapose a native sensibility with that of American capitalism and hopefully acknowledge the mighty land grab on which our country is founded. Through artists' works about fences and walls, boundaries and their trespass, American Domain examines the many ways that territory is continually staked and claimed. The exhibition starts with a Bruce Nauman video in which the artist erects a fence post on his ranch. An hour in duration, the film evidences the performative physical labor of enclosure. A few other highlights include Tom Miller's sculptural wall that illustrates the formal and material qualities of boundary. As an abstracted form, we see the spatial mechanics of barricades. Shot by drone at Standing Rock, Winter Count's video juxtaposes the natural lines of rivers and mountains with those of man-made roads and parking lots. Christine Howard Sandoval's documentary video evidences her own risky trespass into a Superfund site. And as a backdrop to much of the work, Chip Thomas's room-sized mural depicts a 1974 protest of the Navajo Hopi Settlement Act, which relocated Native people to make way for coal production. The upside-down flag operates as a signal of distress. I mention this project as unabashed self-promotion and to connect my recent work with Drop City and Planned. But I think that American Domain might cast an interesting light on communes, land-based projects, and the struggle for utopia. So I'll end with a few questions. Can the countercultural legacy provide models or methods for healing the wounds of capitalism? Can communalism adequately confront the societal norms that the droppers and others have so detested? How does labor, particularly shared labor, bond people to a set of values or a way of life? Beyond a Marxist notion of reclaiming the rights of production, is there collective power in simply getting your hands dirty? Why are so many countercultural artists intent on creating their own thing? Why don't we join up with existing movements or projects? What is this thing of starting from scratch? And finally, in this new world order, when so many of us are called to lean in rather than drop out, how do practices of independence and coexistence commingle to reimagine how we might live better together? Thank you for listening.
So this is what's on now.
Good.
That's what's coming up.
And I can just
And
hit
then
that
either
or hit
that
that.
one or that one.
Yeah,
Okay.
great. Thank you. Thank you, Erin. That was really great and really interesting. And thank you, Greg, for the opportunity to take part here. And thank you, everybody, for coming. Let's see. I'm going to start with a quote from Alicia Bay Laurel, whose book, Living on the Earth, is up on the screen. It introduced alternative living to the mainstream in 1971 and became, I guess, the first paperback to be reviewed in the New York Times and become a bestseller and all that. Anyway, it had a real impact on promoting what we were trying to do to the wider culture. And here are her own words. Wheeler Ranch was the gentlest reality I ever lived. Roll out of bed, don't bother dressing, wander for hours, seeing only nature and friendly faces. Seasons rolled by without clock or calendar, potluck feasts with music jams every Sunday, no cars, lots of quiet. People expanded into their fantasy selves. The ex-con who wore a sheriff's badge and crocheted sweaters for the ladies. The atonal jazz saxophonist in a black cape with the back of his head neatly shaved. I'm going to comment on both of those. Our ex-con, who we call the sheriff, Rod, he could knit a lady's Angora sweater in a day, and he would work all week, and then on weekends he'd take them all down to Route 1 and set up a card table and sell them. And I was so impressed. I thought, my God, he's carved out this little unique niche which can support his very comfortable lifestyle. As for our jazz saxophonist, who became known as Snake Pit Eddie, I probably should go, well, not quite. He became the first president of we had to form a church to try to keep the county from closing us down, and Snake Pit Eddie became our first president. He was called Snake Pit Eddie because he built his house next to a pit that had some snakes in it. Anyway, a bunch of really amazing people. A community of larger-than-life characters, not the least were Bill Wheeler and Lou Gottlieb, who presided over their communities with huge gusto, and the women without fear or rules, who pissed standing up. Indian Chris, who saluted an airborne voyeur by doing a handstand in the buff. In this hot house of rare human flowers, I found inspiration to create a book, the like of which no one had seen before. Wheeler Ranch was devoid of racism, but it had class distinctions. At the back of the land dwelt the, quote, brown ricers, serious about the arts, organizing gardens, and spiritual practices. Near the parking lot at the front gate, the white ricers gathered to drink wine by an old overturned rowboat they dubbed the Yacht Club. They ate government commodities, processed cheese food, peanut butter that had sugar in it. I never saw any of them in the community garden, and today I recognize them on TV shows about the homeless. I'm wildly grateful for the years I spent on open land. Many tribes later, I still think of some of my open land friends as practically blood relatives. Well, thank you, Alicia. This is a Morningstar Ranch aerial view before it became a commune. It was set up as an egg ranch, those long structures you see, and then in the upper center is what became known as the upper house. It was 31 acres, wooded with redwoods, and and had an apple orchard that was really glorious. Here's a shot of Lou Gottlieb and friends, and in the western hills of Sonoma County were two communal experiments. Tolstoy Farm in Washington State was an open gate community before we were, and we recognize them as our spiritual ancestor. Morningstar Ranch was first to be defined by its last human owner as land access to which is denied no one. That was Lou Gottlieb. When the diggers moved in, we viewed ourselves as a group of leaderless leaders on the theory that from the group mind, a spokesman would emerge whenever necessary. However, it definitely was limelighter Lou Gottlieb, PhD, consummate performer, who took center stage. As Morningstar's owner, he also stepped forward when the police asked who was in charge here, at least until he tried to donate the property to God. Lou and I met when he was interviewing Stuart Brand and I just before the Trips Festival in December '65, and I'm much beholden to my friend Eric Christensen, who brought out the Trips Festival movie, and I'm giving him a little promotion. There's some nice shots of Lou and me in it. Morningstar's hierarchy was very fluid, but subgroups formed the, quote, wino camp down by the front gate, the yogis around the barn, the good time transients in the upper house, and the kitchen staff in the lower house. Outside forces required an imposed structure instead of waiting for one to grow naturally, as it did at Wheeler's, our second ranch. Bill Wheeler opened his land when the police made living at Morningstar an arrestable offense. Governor Reagan was quoted at a press conference at that time as saying, "There will be no more Morningstars," and that was almost the same day that Wheeler's opened for settlement. Bill named the process open land. After some years, it proved the theory that a group head would naturally emerge, just beyond having Bill play cop whenever necessary. But speaking of that, during the 6 years the ranch was open and approximately 3,000 plus people came through, Bill only had to ask 5 people to leave. A comparable Sonoma County Straight Society sample from 2005 through 2013, if we combine both property and violent crimes, averaged out to 20.52. That's 4 times the rate we experienced. So we were not as often the majority culture would say, a bunch of lawless people. Brother Bill, by the way, poured himself heart and soul and inheritance into the project. And Lou also, whose bank account was attached by the county to pay $18,000 plus in contempt of court fines, and he also spent 2 weeks in jail for not obeying the permanent injunction that forbade anyone but him to live on the land. Of course, the lack of working toilets at Morningstar was a major disgrace, and because of the close proximity to neighbors, the ranch never would have evolved into a functioning alternative community, in my view. Wheeler's much more isolated, and which stood in its favor, but in each case, one influential neighbor did bring trouble. The diggers arrived in early '67, and here are some photos of various folks. Pam Reed with her baby Anna Siddhartha finally migrated to New Mexico with what I call the graduating class of '67. John and Terry together, and Kathy. When things really hit the fan was when Time magazine came up and did an article on the hippies and included a long interview with a sister at Morningstar. And people really did start coming. I mean, the cars would come up the front drive with faces pasted on the closed windows, looking at us, cameras clicking, and then sometimes the window would roll down and say, "Where's the free love?" And I'd point towards the road going out the back. I'd say, "Oh, just go down that road," and then it'd be out on the county road again. And then we had Lou got tired of answering the phone, so we put in a pay phone, and then there's a chalkboard with various notices. I guess they're legible up there and cute. But, since the land was open, everybody came, including what we got to call the winos. They set up camp right by Lou's in the center of the land, and then there were screams and shouts and fights all night long, and we finally convinced them to move down towards the front gate, and they then kind of supervised the parking area and seemed quite happy to do it because they could go up to a newcomer and say, "Can we watch your car for you?" the idea being if they didn't pass over a couple bucks, they might not have hubcaps. Here is a typical illegal structure photographed by Sonoma County. And just for comparison's sake, here are the Pomo tribal wet dwellings. And, it's such a gentle climate. You really don't need an awful lot to be cozy. Here's Lou's front porch with a wishing well in the background. At Wheeler's, I've seen a totally, let's see, maybe I'll go back a little. Morningstar's lifestyle allowed each person to see themselves reflected in the mirror it provided. When it came time to name the written history of both ranches, titled Home Free Home, which will be out later this year, each person I asked came up with a different name. a blowout center along the lines of British psychologist R.D. Laing, where people lived out their fantasies, a Yuna nursery to regress to infancy and regrow new personas, an ashram devoted to various gurus, a digger farm for growing food to feed everyone. Other name suggestions included Last Resort, Space Colony, Timeout Camp, Sanctuary, City of Refuge, God's Land, Freedom Exercise Camp, Deconditioning Center, and of course just plain open land, or LOO's acronym Latwooden for land to which access is denied no one. And what Lou was fond of saying is the only trouble with open land is there's not enough of it, because then too many people came to the few parts that were there. Ultimately, I personally feel Morningstar functioned as a healing center, perhaps ascribed to the fact, as we learned years later, the ranch had been dedicated and named for the Virgin Mary before Lou bought the place. This might account for the visions of the Divine Mother reported by various hippies. We found that out much later, that whole naming thing. At Wheeler's, I've seen a totally alienated young man wander on, his basic attitude being, just leave me alone. After spending one foggy night shivering under a small pine tree, he decided he'd better look around for something to catch the drips. Scrounging up a piece of plastic, he hung it over a branch and spent a more comfortable night. A night or two later, he ran into an unused window and a tarp. A certain feeling of self-worth began to grow. Also, he noticed that no one was bugging him about doing anything, and soon he found himself returning the smiles he was receiving and accepting a shared pipe full of grass that circulated at one of the meals. When I spotted him about a week later, he said hello and actually struck up a relaxed conversation and wanted to know if he could help in any way. Well, there's always a community garden that needs weeding, I said, and that's where I spotted him next. Some months later, he joined a yoga group and moved north. People really did find themselves there, and I often felt that Wheeler's acted like a gateway to the kingdom of New Albion, which I called the whole thing along the coastal ranges that stretched all the way up through Oregon and state of Washington. And people who didn't know how to live in the country would come to us and have a taste of what you did to survive, and they might get close to their neighbors, because the land was large. It was 320 acres. It broke down into neighborhoods, and they might get close with their neighborhood, and then sometimes the whole neighborhood would take wing and head further north where land was cheap and where there weren't building inspectors coming around to snoop on you. At Wheeler's, we wrestled with the problem of how to, I should go on with some of these, I keep forgetting. When there was a temporary injunction placed on Morningstar, people decided to have a party. So Blue Cheer band came up and played. And then here's one I found we developed a Morningstar card using the Lakota Sioux Morningstar emblem with Sufi circle, heart, six-pointed star, everything combined. And then I spotted a photo. Here it was on the wall in the hay. It was kind of neat. And here's a Morningstar symbol in use. The idea being, if you are inviting people onto your property, you put a Morningstar in your window. This is a photograph. We were all, well, somebody had discovered what today is called ecstasy, when there's then called the MDA, and most of these folks were on it and spent the whole day hugging each other in large groups. And then the cops arrived, and everybody said, "Oh, take our photo, take our photo." We all lined up, and the cops very happily took our photo. And 10 years later, I was working on a scrapbook of everything. I went to the police, the deputy sheriff in Santa Rosa, and said, "By the way, do you have any photographs?" And he looked me up and down, and he opened the center drawer on his desk, took this photo out, and tossed it to me. This was 10 years later, and he still had it there. It was just so funny. Anyway, these are early arrivals, 68 at Wheeler's. Here's Bill and Gwen Wheeler's reposing the American Gothic photo. Here's the first board of directors meeting at Wheeler's. If you wanted to be on the board, you had to show up at sunrise at the top of the hill whenever a meeting was called. And this was the first kind of informal one. That's me with an accordion and Lou Gottlieb next to me and Bill Wheeler's to my right and Lou's to my left. And curly-haired Chuck is next to Lou, all the dear folks. And my partner Victoria is patting Lala, the large black furry thing there. NBC News came up when we had one of our big inspections, and this is a photo of the yurt that Bryce and Charlotte built, and another picture of it got into the Holder's catalog around that time. Here's Alicia and David and Bill Wheeler on a tractor, and then a class held at Bill Wheeler's studio. This was a bunch of real rascally kids. They lived at the end of the land. And Helen, the oldest, wrote her memories of that time. They basically went feral. There were 5 of them. And they were scampering all over the land, getting into all sorts of mischief. Anyway, and then here they are in a steam bath. Steam baths were popular because there were no hot showers. And then Christmas Day, there was a big steam bath, and there's everybody spanking clean. And a typical little house tucked in under a tree. This is all Wheeler's. See, Wheeler's really functioned as a community, and if it had been left alone, it would have prospered. Here's the old two-ton truck making a community run. Bill and Gwen had a lovely little baby and moved into a little house in the garden. Look at this view. Can you imagine? I love that view. And then, of course, it was all too good to be left alone, so in comes the county inspection team. And the attorney Bill hired also hired 2 Brinks guards. I don't know why, but he just felt it was necessary. And again, here are these characters with their parents living at the back of the land. And then Alicia encouraged them to write their own book. So they did a book called Tigger Wheel, and this is one of the photographs, one of the drawings from the book. And then, of course, still we were having too much fun, so we had the big raid at dawn, 150 armed police and prison guards came on the land and held everybody at gunpoint in their various homes and searched for, quote, 2 runaway convicts who they didn't find, and arrested 15 people, all of whom took a plea bargain and were released, except for one guy. And he said, "Those were not my pot plants. I want a jury trial." So he had a jury trial, and the judge looked at the search warrant. He said, you used 1 search warrant to search 70 houses? That's illegal. So he threw the whole thing out. And it created precedent law. For that time forward, you could not go on a communal ranch with 1 search warrant and search all the homes. So that was a great moment of victory. In the meantime, the bulldozers are busy at Morning Star, and they bulldozed the place 3 times. Here's another shot of those prison guards at dawn. They look very spooky. At Wheeler's, we posted 3 rules. Bury your shit, no outdoor fires during fire season, and build your inspired dwelling out of others' views and out of sight of the sheriff's helicopter. This worked pretty well until the county uniforms came on the land with aerial photos, and one inspector checked my hut, wiggled the thumb-wide redwood sticks that supported my canvas roof and said, "This could fall down and injure you." I said, "I could pull the whole thing down around us right now. We'd just brush ourselves off and walk away." But he red-tagged me over my protest. Now, the great irony was that really 2 weeks later, we had one of those 5-point something earth wiggles, and a huge crack opened in the wall of the Santa Rosa courthouse, where Lou had been spending many hours, and the concrete awning over the front of the welfare office fell off, who had been denying us food stamps. Meanwhile, our little cabins cha-cha gently and survived without an exception. How poetic! We were thrilled. The county threats forced us to organize, and Bill's attorney recommended a church structure. Part of our belief system was not to live on a concrete pad and not to use flush toilet. Bare earth floors and a post hole digger with a roll of toilet paper were just fine. The board of directors, as I said, is made up whoever showed up at sunrise. Our church gatherings used peyote as a sacrament. In retrospect, we could have used a Native American roadman. Sunday became potluck feast days, followed by a sauna, in contrast to Morningstar, where most meals were eaten communally. As I have mentioned, I don't think Morningstar would ever have succeeded as a viable community in the consensus reality of those times. We were too close to neighbors, and there was a healing spirit on the land that drew people in large numbers. Wheelers, on the other hand, with larger acreage, much more remote, was on the verge of congealing into a successful, self-sustaining community just when the bulldozers arrived. In one night, the residents burned down 50 homes to keep the roaring machines from breaking trees and desecrating the land. Here's one of the houses going up in flames. It was right during the end of the rainy season, so it was safe to torch these homes. Here's another one going up in flames. I watched this from a ridge over. I was going to put that slide in here. It was really something out of Dante, the whole thing. And then the Berkeley Barb covered the story. In the dedication of the book that I'm finishing, I write, I dedicate this book to all my brothers, amazing brothers and sisters who suddenly found themselves on the front lines of New Age consciousness, and in honor of our two amazing brothers, Lou Gottlieb and Bill Wheeler. The dynamic duo sacrificed everything for the landless and forgotten, withstood police and civil harassment from Sonoma County, suffered great wrongs, but persisted despite years of undeserved persecution. You will be lovingly remembered long after the pinch-nosed, low-forehead types who held all the trump cards are butt dust in the outhouse of history. Power to the naked, nameless, homeless, and harmless. And one last shot of Lou pointing the way. And that was what he always said, private property is original sin, folks. Sorry about that. And then of course, now once Lou was dead and out of the way, then the Press Democrat ran a lovely 50 years of famous people in Sonoma County, and there's Lou with his baby and his charming partner, Rena Morningstar. Once you're dead, then, you're no longer a problem. We can celebrate you. So that's it, folks. Sorry if I went over time.
So now we're going to go to preview. Let's see.
Oh, I think I have it set up.
Do you know how to set it up?
There we go. Hello. So I'm going to say a little bit about Salmon Creek Farm. I should just preface this by saying I'm a little ambivalent about talking about it for a couple of reasons. One is that the commune as it originally existed is not really my story to tell. It's theirs. And I've been very sensitive to that as I've been living there and reviving it in some way. On the other hand, I think it is an important bit of history to take forward and for us to understand and learn from, which is why I'm there. So I'm kind of carefully riding this line between wanting to be respectful of their lives there and their history and not turning it into some strange kind of romanticized theme park or something, but at the same time really being sensitive to it and to continue it in some way. The other reason is that I'm living in the middle of an immersive project that I still don't totally understand, and it's still in the very early days of kind of happening around me, and it's my intention that it continue as long as I'm around and then after me. And I'm coming out of a very long period of public work that involved a lot of travel and public talking and public projects, and I'm in the midst of really something that's really quite the opposite. But I thought for the Hippie Modernism show, which I think is great, and for the Berkeley Art Museum, I really wanted to leave the woods for a moment and tell you about this place. Salmon Creek Farm was founded in 1971 by Robert Greenway, who had very strong ideas about communal living. He was, I believe, a philosophy professor in Sonoma State. I don't want to go off into a story of the place that I feel like I might misrepresent. I'm not a scholar. I'm just someone who's been asking a lot of questions of everyone I know who was associated with the place originally. But it was founded by Robert Greenway and his partner at the time, River, which was a commune name, and most of the people that were at Salmon Creek Farm took on commune names. And it was a blended family, the two of them and their 6 boys, who were ranging in ages, I believe, from 8 or 9 to their mid-teens. And all of those boys took on commune names like Salmon and Hawk and Huckleberry, and a lot of them built cabins, and a lot of those cabins are still there, and we still use them. So the commune really, every commune was different, and I think people's idea of utopia says more about who they are and where they're coming from than it does about what most humans want. I think people in the suburbs or in the cities want to go to the woods. People in the woods, their utopia is communal living in the city. Salmon Creek Farm was founded by young hippies, countercultural radicals, I guess, who were also coming from rather comfortable lives for the most part. These were mostly well-educated, middle-class, white, straight, young people who were really disgusted and disenchanted with mainstream society and were really searching for something else. And there's something beautiful about that moment, I think, of kids in their early 20s who are popping their heads up, looking at the world that they're inheriting. And I think it's a very critical moment of reckoning when that happens. And that's the moment that these communes were formed by kids who were kind of at that moment in their lives. By the way, I'm just showing pictures of current Salmon Creek Farm life, not from the archives. I do post sometimes pictures from the archives on Instagram, but I didn't really want to give present the historic story of Salmon Creek Farm, which I don't feel prepared to tell you. However, this is one of our reunion dinners, and this is Dawn, who built the cabin that we now uses our communal cabin, and this is her partner, Bob, who are my neighbors. I'm surrounded on 3 sides of the property by 3 former communards there who bought neighboring properties and built homes next door, and obviously felt strongly enough about the place to stay there. And even though they decided to leave at some point, they stuck around. So that's my dog Zuka smelling bear poop. Sometimes bears show up. That's funny. These are just random pictures from the last couple of years that I'm showing. anyway, back to the 70s. So they were, right, they wrote a charter, which is really wonderful. And I have from the original Communards a box of their archives, which includes their meeting minutes, correspondence, photographs, posters, ephemera that to them is kind of ridiculous and silly and inconsequential in some cases, and to me is just like this treasure trove of fascinating information. But they were generous enough to turn that over to me. I think after I lived there for a while and they became comfortable with me, they felt comfortable turning that over. But in this charter, they talk about wanting to create a place where they're practicing consensus decision making, where they're free to explore their individual creative selves in solitude at the same time that they're able to be together with other people in a deeply communal way. So that's one thing that I found to be true of living there. There are, oh God, I think back in the day there were as many as 26 structures. Now there's about 11 or 12 or 13. I've found a few abandoned cabins in the woods. But each cabin is invisible from the other in the woods, and what you get in daily life there are extremes of profound solitude, silence in the woods, and then a cabin full of people coming together for meals, which is can be very intensely communal. So you can have, depending on how life is going there, these real extremes. And I would imagine when it was fully operating as a commune, that must have been quite remarkable, that those extremes of the two things. But these were very organized hippies. They were raising kids. They were very practical. They had this incredible just paper trail of correspondence and letters and decision making, where I could see like how they were thinking and how they were running the place. And they had these Sunday meetings that sometimes lasted all day. Where every bit, the minutia of daily life there was decided. So if something came up during the week, they would figure it out on Sunday meetings. And they started out with clearing sessions. I forget what the terminology for it is for it, but they would just articulate gripes that they had, so they could get those out of the way, so that wouldn't get in the way of their meetings. They had someone who would check the vibe to make sure the vibe was always okay. But these meetings could sometimes last the whole day, and they would encompass everything from big decisions about who's the member to how many pieces of fruit the kids were allowed to have a day. But these meetings could be really exhausting. They also eventually decided not everything had to be by consensus. They had 3 levels of decision making. Least important decisions were anarchy. Decisions that were kind of important could be majority rule, but for important decisions like full-time permanent members, they had to be consensus and unanimous. And even children had full votes. So there are stories, for example, of people coming for 3-month trial visits to see if they could become full members. People had to vote, and there was one guy who was there that everyone liked, and it came time to vote, and there was one 6-year-old who just said no, and that was it. So the person couldn't join. But children were, I think, a big part of the place at the time. And Albion, it's been interesting living there for a while now and knowing so many of the old hippies, because I'm starting to get a little bit of a window into what the culture of the place was like before. There were so many communes in Albion that they called it Albion Nation. The commune at the end of the ridge, Table Mountain Ranch, started a school. And even the town kids went to the commune to go to school. That's how much a part of the culture it was. The town kids were bussed in to the end of the ridge to go to school with the hippie kids. Table Mountain was the biggest commune in the area. They had in 1 year 2,000 people show up at the gate just wanting to check it out, and they had to have someone stationed at the gate that could just, or whoever was around the gate had to be trained to size someone up in 3 seconds, to be like, sorry, you can't come in, or come for dinner, and maybe you can stay a night. Salmon Creek Farm is a little bit more secluded. It's on 35 acres of coastal redwoods. There's a clearing and an orchard at the top corner, and it was a little bit more, I get the sense that it was a little bit more private, but there was still a lot of just this huge migration of young kids looking for land for free people, as the 60s turned into the early 70s and things started to get a little bit ugly in the cities. You had kids coming up to this area, an area that was heavily logged. So the logging of the redwoods began in the 1800s, and it was clear cut around the turn of the century once, and then again there was another logging, at least on this land, in the 50s. So they were moving into an area that was really an industrial, post-industrial landscape in a way, a logged landscape and mills along the coast that were then being closed as the wood was used up. It's come to the point now where because I've been talking to so many of them for so long, since I moved there 2.5 years ago, I've almost feel like I've turned the corner where I know more than any one of them individually, because I've talked to so many of them and have so many of their stories. I occasionally find myself correcting them on dates or filling them in on information that they may not know about. So it has entered a period where I feel like I feel like I can somewhat, represent the history of the place, and feel confident like I've gathered enough different points of view to understand what might have been going on. However, the people that I am talking to are the people that were still on good terms, that were still, stuck around. There's, I think, a lot of people who passed through during the years who maybe didn't leave on such good terms, who have maybe different stories to tell. The commune was founded in 71, and it dissolved towards the mid to late 80s. Gradually, one by one, they just decided that they needed more independence, more conventional lives in single-family homes with nuclear families. And as they were raising kids, I think there became more complexity around communal parenting. Should kids be smoking pot or not? Things like that. Were just decisions that people couldn't, as soon as raising kids together came into the mix, that became a complexity. Anyway, so in the late 80s, one by one, they moved away and people rented out their cabin individually. One by one, they just rented out their cabins. And the commune entered a period of just kind of strange dormancy, where the cabins were occupied, but people were living alone in them in the woods. And it was no longer a commune. It was just like hermits living secluded in these cabins. Not necessarily hermits. I mean, they were part of society. They had jobs. It was just like, normal rentals, but it was no longer a commune. And also, a lot of the infrastructure just kind of got abandoned, and the pathways connecting the cabins became overgrown. So in 2014, after almost 10 years of mostly being on the road and doing very itinerant urban projects, I started to crave the opposite, which was a settled rural life and a life that was more in touch with the daily rhythm of the land and animals and plants, but it still wanted to be connected to people and part of a community. So almost 12 years ago, I really had almost a fully formed idea of this kind of life that I wanted, and it's taken me this long to get to it. But what I was realizing is the life that I was promoting and exploring in my work, which involved urban wildlife projects and food production in cities and rewilding cities, and I was not able to have in my daily life. My daily life was email and travel and planes and airports, but the work that it was making was vegetable gardens and urban wildlife habitat and things like this. So there was this kind of strange rift that existed that couldn't hold very long. So anyway, 2.5 years ago, I bought Salmon Creek Farm and have been slowly fixing it up along with an gradually expanding community of people who are there in and out as well. I'm the only full-time person, and at this point, it's a very personal project. I'm there full-time, and other people come and go, but I can imagine a future as it gradually becomes less connected to me personally, and it becomes more communal, and hopefully it will continue after me. So I see myself as hopefully this a person in between the past, the commune that it was before, and some more institutionalized future retreat that it might be after me. I'm thinking that long term about it. So it happens to be in a very personal place where I'm there living full time, and I'm exerting a lot of control over big decisions about how it's fixed up and what's going on there. But my grip will loosen gradually over time as I get more feeble and weak, and can gradually turn it over to a group that's coming there. The intention of the place that I started with, which is remaining true, is that it not be a commune for full-time people to just move in and live in a rather insular, permanent, settled way. But nor is it a place where people come for short-term, one-time visits. It's something in between. So there's a community of people that come and go and then come again. And I find that to be a really important model so that the place has a consistency and a community to it, but at the same time doesn't ossify into a fixed, something that's overly fixed. So that people come, they contribute, they build upon the place, they have a profound experience, hopefully, then they go back into their lives, and something of that place goes back out into the world, and then they come back and they bring something else with them and they build upon what someone else did, so that there's constant life force flowing through both in and out. And it's taken equal amounts of time to fix the place up, as both fixing the place up and making it habitable is happening simultaneous to the community establishing itself. And I think there's something important about the people who are using the place, making the place. I think my intention is for money to be involved as little as possible, to have a very modest existence there with minimal requirements for actual money, so that people come there without paying. It can be as much of a possible as a money-free zone where we're growing our own food, and living very simply. It's not off the grid, but I am trying to get solar there, an off-grid solar system. That's the next step. And yeah, I guess I can talk more about it as we open it up to a conversation here, but I feel like there's a great deal of, there's a lot that I'm really confused about. The place is a deep pleasure, and I'm exactly where I want to be, and there's a lot of wonderful people coming up and participating. The biggest issue that I'm having right now is who is there and who isn't there. Who is there because they have the freedom to take a week or two or more or a few months every year to come to a place like this, and who doesn't have that opportunity. I've had a lot of really interesting young kids scheduled to come up, and at the last minute just saying, I can't. A job came up, I have to take it. I can't not work for a week. And every November, I put out an open call to students and recent grads who can send letters of interest to come for trial visits, so that there's always kind of new blood coming through. But I realize what a privilege it is just to be able to leave your life for that period of time. And it's the biggest issue that I'm confronting, and I'm going to have to figure that out somehow. But it's the big. I'm constantly living with this split between 1971 and today. I was born in '69, around that time, and I'm constantly aware of the life these kids had in this land, how resourceful it was, how simple it was. They didn't have cell phones. They barely had cars. They didn't have electricity or landlines. They were such radical political people, but they didn't even follow the news anymore when they moved up there. I mean, they just dropped out. And they could afford to drop out because they weren't in debt, because they came from some privilege, but also there wasn't this profound kind of immoral student debt that we have, that kids come out at 22 now enslaved into a system they didn't have a chance to question. And it's the biggest problem, I think, that we face today with young people. If there's any hope for any change or any thoughtful future, it's going to be on a generation that now doesn't have a chance to properly question the system that they're entering into because they're already in it. And there's such urgency to establish yourself professionally that there's not this chance to kind of wander and question as much as there was at this time, I think. Anyway, I'll end it there, and then maybe we can have more questions after. Thanks.
You can leave that up. That's a great background slide. And let me invite our panelists up. So thank you very much. Those were great introductions and talks. A little plug for a project that took off at Fritz's Salmon Creek. This is a copy of the Henbane, which is the first issue, published right here at BAMPFA, at least the cover was, and this is the successor publication to Country Women, which was a really important journal for women who were participating in the Back to the Land movement. So your institution, whatever things it's doing, is already kind of doing things in the world that take this kind of moment on forward. So I'm just going to start out with a couple comments or things to start a conversation, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well. And one of the things that I wonder about, and that Erin and I talked about in a phone conversation, was this concept of the rural. Because really, even the most remote counterculture communes were really tied to cities by the nomadic patterns of inhabitants, also underground publications or mainstream publications. Salmon Creek sounds a little bit different in that there was a kind of closure of a certain sort of media connection with cities.
One thing at Salmon Creek Farm, the week I got there, Verizon installed a cell phone tower on the ridge, and my neighboring hippies weren't really aware of what that meant, like really, really fast, good connection. And they were dependent on their landlines, and I've never hooked up a landline. We have this signal now, and now we've got this incredible internet service that's a network of receivers and transmitters on top of redwoods that goes up the coast from Point Arena, the sub-oceanic cable connecting to North America to Asia. So we've got this incredible internet that's in some cases faster than what people have in the city. And people come to visit, and they're actually rather disappointed at how connected they are, because there's this fantasy they're going to drop out into their cabin, and yet But also Salmon Creek Farm did have a press, a few presses. There was Times Change Press, which did some really amazing publications, and it was always connected through, I think a lot of the communes were really active with publishing.
One of our favorite questions that we would ask residents when they were leaving Planned was, so would you rather live without running water or without the internet? And most people would say, I'd rather live without running water, which was interesting to just kind of put that to the test. But to bring it back to rural, I think there's something so specific about different places, and I kind of heard that in all the talks, is that there's this commitment to a place. And I think one thing I became aware of in moving to rural New Mexico is that I had so many assumptions about how easy it would be to slip into this place where seemingly nobody existed. And northern New Mexico is a very territorial, very historic, very intense kind of culture, and newcomers are not necessarily welcome in different situations. And I think when a group of people show up in a rural setting, everybody knows that they exist, for one, and that was a little bit of a challenge to navigate, and just to be, I think, sensitive to the cultures that are already there, to the individuals that have a great stake in keeping their land or their lifestyle as it is. And that's not, maybe you encounter that in urban settings as well, but it's more dramatic in a rural place, I think.
A story that one of our Morningstar people who went to New Mexico told was about Truchas. Truchas is way up in the hills and is settled by a group called the Penitentes that have a whole type of religion that's quite unique. They tattoo their babies doomed to die and drive crazily through these back hills, and then the night before Easter they drive through town firing into everyone's homes to remind them of their mortality. So everyone's hugging the floors while bullets are flying through their homes. So that's a kind of typical little cultural moment that I thought was unique. But also at Wheeler's, a couple of things evolved. One was something we called canyon calls. We didn't have phones, but everyone had a unique call. So if you're going to go visit somebody and you get within calling range, you call out your call, yoo-hoo, or ha-ha, or whatever it is, and then if they're responding, they'll call back. But if they're not in a visiting mode, they won't. And at that point you say, oh, I'll visit some other time. So it was a cute little connection thing that built in. The other thing was about carrying water. I was carrying my own water for the first year I was there, and I'd take my jugs and go down to the spring, and the spring was like a little drip. It would take about 10 minutes to fill a gallon. And it was really a wonderful meditative thing. I'd sit there quietly and getting my water jug filled, and all these little creatures would come out. You know, so many of these little animals hover around a water source. And then I'd take my jugs back. And then when my partner became pregnant, I thought, well, now's the time I really have to put in running water. So I ran a PVC pipe down the hillside and got a little sink. And of course, from that point on, I had no reason to go back to the spring. So in a way, every little luxury you add on takes you another step away from something built into you and into nature, which is so valuable. So it's always this strange trade-off, you know. There was a film called Affluenza that came out some years ago. I don't know if you've seen it, but it looks into the whole American affluence thing. And then they came out with another one called Escape from Affluenza. It was kind of a nice follow-up. But those are films that might be worth looking up for people.
It's interesting that lessons of Wheeler, Ranch, and Morningstar, if they could be lessons, really seem to have to do with complete conflict with local community. I mean, it's kind of irreconcilable. And then today, your experience is that in a way, you've come in, you're revitalizing a place, and in a sense, kind of reviving that community history. So has the notion of outsiders coming to the land been that transformed over time? Maybe you can tell us about your experience. You said that in some ways you experienced a conflict when crimes started to happen in other with other local residents, and there was some suspicion that emerged.
Yeah, I don't want to paint too negative a view of it. But I think one thing to note is that now there are a lot of people like Ramón who have had these lived experiences who are still in these areas, a lot of them, your neighbors you mentioned. So I think it's a different experience to move into a previously countercultural space and have these kind of mentors almost, and to see how they continue to be invested in these small towns or rural places, and also what kind of strategies they've developed for their living situation, whether it's they become a master gardener or they've learned water catchment. Like, there's just so much knowledge to be harvested from those previous generations. And a lot of those people seem to have stayed, whether or not they're living in communes. I am constantly encountering people who have amazing stories of, their endeavors in the 60s and 70s. So it's a real honor, I think, to meet people like Ramón who have those stories to share.
I was just wondering about Robert Greenaway. He was an eco-psychologist, wasn't he? He was very deeply involved in the notion that these outdoor settings are extremely important for us as a kind of therapy. Is that tradition still, do you feel alive where you are now?
The tradition
Of kind of environmentist therapy.
locally in Albion or at.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess so. It's strange. He founded the commune, but he wasn't there more than 5 years, so he wasn't involved that long term. The boys needed to go to school, and they needed to move away to a place where the kids could be raised. So it's strange. He founded it, and his imprint is so strong in it, but he actually was not involved very long or very deeply involved. I think the thing that I keep returning to over and over again, like asking why I'm there and why other people are there, is this craving for some contact with real wilderness, a wilderness that is humbling and that's scary, and there's nothing more humbling than the redwoods in that kind of landscape. You feel so small, and I think for him originally, and for me today, and for a lot of the people coming, I think there's almost something you can't quite articulate about that need to be in proximity to that sometimes. And I think there's that combined with the connection to a Native American history, which was also very important for them. That was a huge part of the original culture of Salmon Creek Farm, was Native American ritual, which they'll admit they were very naive about it. They totally didn't understand, but they did peyote circles at the solstice and had sweat lodges and all these things. But I think those two things of you talked about this idea of colonization, and you can't help but feel that when you're there. And I think at least to be there and to be humbled by the wilderness and to be humbled by the Native American history there, you have to be conscious of. So though I have these elders around me, ultimately it's really those other forces that I think are more important.
Bob Greenway, I think he was co-author of the Raspberry Exercises book that Sally Raspberry put together, and it was all about how to start an alternative school. And I think he was in Sonoma County for a while too, teaching at Sonoma State.
That's right.
I'm just thinking about what it might mean to live in sort of a lawless place, even if it's a place where building regulations are not enforced. But certainly the Mesa where I lived was a place where the law didn't really even investigate these crimes that I mentioned. And when you're in a community that doesn't have rules or has very few rules, maybe consensus is like the main rule, I think there is a whole different set of strategies that emerge about how you communicate with each other. And I think nature is actually a like unifying force, that even if your neighbor seems like they might have a meth lab going over there and it's kind of sketchy, like you can still talk about the rainstorm last night and how'd you do? Are you okay? Did you get your truck out from the mud? There's something about nature that's just incredibly unifying that these rural spaces, I think, bring about. And I don't know, it's an interesting experience to live without rules. And I don't know that I would recommend it for everyone or forever, but I can see why people continually kind of experiment with setting their own.
Well, there was a lot of conflict between the hippies and the old ranchers in Sonoma County, but then they discovered they could agree on the beauty of the land and how it should be preserved, and a lot of the left people who are involved with the land trusts and so forth, they could go to these farmers and say, look, instead of, we know your farm is your retirement, so to speak, but instead of parceling it up and selling it off, you could put half of it into a land trust, and then, the tax thing becomes important, and you could probably do pretty well. And these guys started listening, so there's been areas of mutual interest that I think have bridged what at first seemed like impossible gaps, so to speak. Everyone who's in love with the land is going to have that to talk about. I loved your photos of the redwoods. Those early slides you showed reminded me very much of Morningstar, and one of the reasons why I moved up there.
Just one last thing I was wondering about. When I look at this episode of the Back to the Land movement, it really reminds me of that Digger motto, create the situation you describe. People were creating a new situation. It often, for example, in Wheeler Ranch, in Planned even, ends up being a temporary condition. It doesn't end up having a long lifespan. Your project is actually rather different in that regard in terms of the revival. I teach a seminar at UC Berkeley called Design Radicals, and often my students feel that notion of the temporary quality of these settlements, because they're supposed to be settlements, they equate it with a kind of failure. How would you describe it in a sense of the outcome of that experiment, or how that experiment can be looked at so that it's not framed in its temporary nature as a failure?
Well, first of all, I would say the idea that the communal movement is dead or dying is not correct. All you have to do is look into the Directory of Intentional Communities put out by Communities magazine that lists over 500 different groups, I believe. The enormous publicity that the communes were exposed to in the 60s was not helpful. It I think, cut short many experiments which had been allowed to grow naturally, might have had different outcomes. At the same time, those of us who were promoting open land felt it was important to get the message out. So we were kind of caught between the two extremes. I mean, Lou kept saying, only thing wrong with open land is not enough of it, and he tried in various ways to get other parcels open, and actually he did. It was one couple open land in Kentucky, and some years later oil was discovered on it. So they sold the land and moved elsewhere with quite a pocket full of cash. But no, there were other lands, and pluses and minuses occurred.
Any sense of?
Well, I know there's a book called West of Eden which has a section on Salmon Creek Farm. It's about Northern California communes. And I've gotten to know the authors a bit. There's 3 of them. And they start out the book by saying it was really hard to get people to talk because they're very sensitive about being misrepresented. You know, hippies and communes, it's like, gets really sensationalized. And also represented as a failure. And I think if 20 people can live together on a piece of land for almost 20 years, raising kids and growing their own food and building their own houses, that's pretty good. And it represents like a very particular period of life when you're, open to that, let's say. And I think, things aren't always meant to last forever. And I don't think it's fair to call it a failure because it didn't last forever and people didn't end up dying there in their old age or something. But I think I'm really most interested in just that impulse of what it took for people to do that, show up in the woods and camp with no infrastructure at all. Like, that's how it started. That's how Salmon Creek Farm started. A winter in a tent on a creek at the bottom of a valley in the redwoods with nothing, and kids. And I mean, I just can't even believe how they did it. Now, like, the propane goes out in one of the cabins and we freak out, or the power goes out or whatever. I mean, I just lose my mind. But they, it's pretty incredible.
I think failure is pretty generative, actually. I don't know that it's just like a, totally bad thing. And I think there was a lot of that kind of fertilization of new ideas that was happening around the commune movements. And I certainly saw it. Libre was a commune that kind of sprouted up near Drop City. And in my research, I came to learn about it. And the founders, Linda and Dean Fleming, they actually visited Drop City and they saw a lot of things that they didn't want to do. They didn't want to all live in the same house. They didn't want to, share clothing. They didn't want to have as much of an open door policy. And so they kind of created their commune in response to the things that they thought were failing in Drop City. And that commune is still around. They celebrate 50 years next year. And I think there's something that's really, one place goes up in flames and another place is kind of fed by that. So you never really know what is going to ripple out from your own experience.
Chairman Mao, who said, "May 1,000 flowers bloom." They don't all have to look the same.
Yeah.
So let me open this up to comments, and I'll send, are we sending just one mic out? Oh, okay. So over here.
When I was researching the documentary that I made on the Trips Festival and interviewed Ramón, I wanted to amplify what he did right after the Trips Festival with Morningstar. And Ramón turned me on to a wonderful soundbite that's in the documentary. And when I was researching about Morningstar, all the local news just did the sensational sex and drugs aspect of Morningstar. But Canadian Broadcasting actually sent a UC Berkeley journalist to interview Lou. And Lou said, what we're doing here is an experiment of how we will have to live in the future. Because it's going to be a cybernated world with robots doing a lot of the work. And we're going to have to learn how to deal with this leisure time. So, this is a 1968, 67 interview with Lou having that forward thought. And I think, to me it was really, really illuminating that he thought in those terms. And just briefly, one of the other little asides about communities, I used to grow up in the Haight-Ashbury and visited a lot of them. At Olam Poly, which the Grateful Dead lived, owned by USF, but rented by Dan McCoy, about 10 years ago, I drove by, and it's a state park now, and I wanted to show my son and my wife what it looked like because some of the structures are still there. And all of a sudden, all these long-haired, gray-grained people came, and they said, "Oh, are you here for the reunion?" I said, "No, not really, but I was here before." And I asked one woman, and this is kind of an illustrative story of how a lot of communes failed, what do you think happened that was the downfall. I said, well, all of us who worked in the garden would be there most of the day, and then by the time we got back to the kitchen, all the hangers-on had eaten all the food. That's apocryphal.
I don't know. I think what closed Olin Poly was the fact that the adults did not keep close enough an eye on the kids, and 2 kids drowned, and the horses got out on 101, and it's just a bunch of, again, I think the wrong place you have to figure out where you're going to do this sort of thing in terms of the surroundings, and just right next to 101 is not a good idea. By the way, there's a documentary being made about Olin Poly, if they can raise the fund.
This is a kind of a follow-up to Greg's last question. One thing I was really struck by in all your presentations was this kind of tension between permanence and transience, between places like Morningstar and Wheeler that it seems like were kind of designed to be these long-term homesteads, places like Planned that were more of designed for this educational short-term experience, and then Salmon Creek, which it seems like is somewhere in the middle. And I think you see this culturally as well, with Fuller and Brand and these long-term thinking permaculture kind of ideas, and then like Buddhist philosophy of, dharmic transience. And I'm curious how you all think about time scale in your communities, how you design for time, and how you think about what happens next, I guess.
I've been thinking a lot about that actually, and I think Planned was really created in also this light of social practice and kind of community-based art, which is really critical of how duration works within a community. Like, you don't just drop in and do a project and leave, that's somehow irresponsible. And I think we were certainly conscious of that, but wanted to create a sort of landing pad that was okay for people to come for a short period of time, but that our relationship to the place was longer and more in depth, and we could be sort of like a middleman to these experiences. But I don't know, it just seems like this part of what you were talking about, Fritz, I think, is how do we create experiences, because we're such an experience-based culture now. Our society is just, this fast. And so I think it's important to create moments that we can metabolize that teach us something about communalism or something about the grid. And if that happens over a long weekend, sometimes that's enough to change somebody's perspective. And a year-long project can change the course of your entire life. So I don't know that long-term, forever durations have to be part of moving forward. In fact, I think maybe smaller moments are an important part of change. I don't know.
My background is in architecture, so I was schooled, in an environment that was, kind of obsessed with permanence and obsessed with this making a mark that would live beyond you. And I think all of my work has been migrating away from that. And specifically in terms of time, I think about planting a tree. And if you're going to plant a tree, then already innate in that is a connection that is deep and expansive in terms of time, so that if you're planting a fruit tree like this tall, which I'm going to tomorrow, I'm going to be thinking about that fruit in 10 or 15 or 20 years that's going to be on that tree. And I think living in a time where our connections to particular pieces of land are so superficial, and so we're just so profoundly disconnected from a piece of land, that's important, to have that experience for people who come there, to see something grow for that long, and to make that kind of commitment. And I've also gotten really into carpentry, and I'm practicing what I'm calling improvisational carpentry, which is not what you would do as an architect, making plans and having people execute it for you. I just find scraps of wood and throw them together with, working on these cabins. So the cabins, they tell me, the old hippies, that they didn't expect these cabins to survive more than 10 years, and yet here they are 40 years later, and we're using them and fixing them up. And I think, I like that nature of a structure that's so organic and so alive that it can fall apart, that keep being patched together over time as needs change, as materials change. So I don't know, if it's almost like treating the buildings like a much more short-lived thing that can fall apart and be reconstituted, but treating the landscape as something that's more permanent in a way and requires more long-term thinking. So it's a kind of an inversion of how we typically think of landscape being so ephemeral and buildings being so permanent. I'm finding a relationship that's actually really opposite.
It was really interesting to hear your story about filling up the water jug and some of your experiences in Planned. It sounds like these are communities where people actually can go to escape fast tempo and to move into have whatever experience they can have of slow time, which is for us in our strange lives a kind of luxury now, in a sense.
And also sort of painful. I think one thing we really employed with Planned is that you couldn't come for just a couple hours. You had to spend a whole day at least. And there's something important about falling asleep in a place and waking up there and experiencing the 24-hour cycle. And some people struggle with that. And I think that struggle is actually kind of an important part of all of these projects. And I think it's an interesting to see it in the title of the show. It's a hard work, and it involves putting all of your norms to the test.
So it's a struggle for a kind of temporal utopia, or at least a different temporality.
Yeah, or just a
inhabit it.
different consciousness. Yeah.
Okay, so I have two burning questions. The first one relates to kind of the older communes that are I don't remember your guys' names, but the older communes that you were talking about. Ramón. And then what you said about somebody in the interview saying that, oh, this is like the future, like what we're going to have to do when robots take over all of our jobs and whatnot, and we have all this time. That's kind of what's happening in like rural America, and that's what like led up to, or part of what led up to the election, I think, and people just being really downtrodden, and the inequality between rural and urban really just becoming so vast as to being completely alienating. And like Hochschild wrote about it, strangers in their own land, like how rural Americans are just like feeling like their countries being taken over. And I think the political situation when these older communes were created was somewhat similar, although we're not necessarily in like a drafting war. There is like this kind of conservatism coming over the country, and that led to like a backlash of young people saying like, no, like we just can't deal with reality. But I wonder what it is about, like, because ostensibly these rural communities, if they came together and like lived off the land, would have like potentially a higher standard of living than currently, when they really, from what I understand, it's like extremely hard to get by. There's not much to do. There's a lot of drug use, because I can't imagine, like, there's just not much to do, and an isolating kind of experience. So I wonder what that would take, like, in your opinion, which is more educated than mine, to kind of make this, or if there's a future in like this alternative lifestyle becoming like what is required to survive, especially in rural areas where there isn't that option of just going to a privileged like urban existence. Like, this is something you have to deal with if you want to live on the land. And wait, I'm not finished. And and I kind of experienced that. I lived in a community, intentional community in Arizona called Wind Spirit, and so you had like this like kind of oasis of like kind of older, they're like older hippies from like Woodstock, and then you had like these older men as well living in trailers off of like food stamps and SSI, and they would have like these dinners together, and they would just say racist things, and then the older hippies would just be like, oh, that's our neighbors. And so it's like interesting that interaction, that they would be living in like a nicer house if they decided to join the intentional community, but there was something like culturally blocking them, that would actually improve their life, but there was something about living in a trailer alone which appealed to them. That's number one. And number two, this phenomenon, especially now, like in the pictures of Morning Star, there was one black person that I saw, but largely, especially now, and like if you look at Salmon Creek, it's like largely white. There's not even one like person of color that I could see in the photos, and so what like it seems to be like largely a white phenomenon, at least now, and I wonder. Like, especially since it is a way to pool money and it's like a way to have a better lifestyle without working so hard. Like, what is again that shit like that why is it? Why do you think it's like not more racially inclusive, or why it's more of a white person phenomenon?
Good question. Yeah. I don't know. People get accustomed to a way of living and a way of surviving, really, and it's hard to break out of those patterns. I used to think, gosh, if all these single mothers, if a whole bunch of single mothers on welfare pooled their income, they could buy a piece of land and have their own place. Uh, then Jim Jones came along, and he kind of did that. He kind of organized the welfare people and used their money for his own purposes, actually. But so it was like a good idea gone wrong, and I think it's kind of ruined that idea for a lot of people too. But I'm not answering your question, and it's hard for me to put my. The only thing I can do is say I dream of a time when we are more nomadic. You know, when we were hunter-gatherers, we were healthier and we lived longer than when we settled down into little villages. And then when one person got sick, everybody got sick. And our food became different too, and it wasn't quite as healthy and nourishing. So maybe someday as a singularity arrives and we are all living healthy lives when we don't need to be settled down in one place, and land is open, and people realize that private property has been kind of a bind to us. Maybe we will all go into our little floaters and float around the landscape, and we'll plant orchards everywhere, so you can just settle down in one place for a while and live on the fruits of the land and then move on. I don't know. There's something going to happen that's a whole lot different than what we got now, and I know it's disturbing to a whole big chunk of our people, and they're the ones who voted for Trump. And just exactly how that's going to play out, I have no idea, but it's going to be interesting.
Oh, well, one thing I've been very aware of too in Albion is what a deep, I mean, like I said at the beginning, it was white, middle class, well educated, suburban kids mostly. But I've been aware of like what a deep tradition there is of, well, there's the women's communes, which led to Country Women and the zine revival that you showed. But part of that was a really deep and special community of women in Albion at the communes, 2 women's communes, a big community of lesbians in the woods, a big queer community, but the men weren't there. Like if you can imagine the 70s after Stonewall and before AIDS, they were all in the cities as far as I can tell, though there weren't many gay men out in the woods. So I'm thinking of diversity, and I'm thinking of who's there and why are they there and who isn't there and why aren't they there. And I think that period of time in the 70s was one thing. Today it's something else. And I know that when there were 15 women gathered at Salmon Creek Farm a few months ago to produce the new zine, Rachel, who organized it, has a very diverse community of people who identify gender, sexuality, race, all over the place, a beautiful community of people. And they really got into really complicated, fraught conversations about feminism, gender, racial identity, all of these things. And it's something that I think is, you know, as soon as you leave the city and go into a rural place, there's all kinds of flags that go up for the queer community, for non-white people, of just safety. of transgender people. And when you're in the woods, some people don't feel comfortable. And the country is not a romantic place. You know, it's actually a place that's very threatening for a lot of people. So my mission with Salmon Creek Farm is to make this, you know, experience of wilderness open to as many people and as many kinds of people as possible who want it. And starting there, I don't know. That's all I can say at the moment, I guess.
Yeah, I've been really questioning this too, because it seems like a lot of communes, it's about kind of creating or magnetizing like people together. And in this world, I feel like we need to learn how to coexist with people of difference. So how does all of that work? You know, the communes, the historic ones, many of them had these kind of open door policies too, but at the same time, they were open maybe to only certain people with a certain mindset or a certain kind of look. They were trained at the gate to know in 3 seconds if they could come in. So I don't know. I don't know if communes are something that I think can really help us live better in the world or not. Maybe they can help us kind of articulate certain ways of living. I think they've certainly helped a lot with kind of technologies due to like off-the-grid living or getting kind of back to the land, growing vegetables, making decisions. But in terms of like larger world strategies, I'm not sure. It's something that it's a really good question. And I'm also very aware that the kind of rural situation that you described sounds very much like the Taos Mesa, and I think it was extremely eye-opening for us to see that off-the-grid living had all of these different kinds of styles and reasons, and that there's an incredible amount of suffering that is happening in rural America, and a lot of people are hiding from it, and people are going off-grid for a reason, and it's not just to see if they can be self-sufficient with solar power or to grow their own vegetables. It's to hide from the government, to, you know, to nurture their mental illness. And I find that to be really unsettling. I don't know how to confront that either, but there's a lot of suffering happening in rural places. We hear about it in urban cities a lot, but there's a huge dialogue that needs to happen about our rural communities. So I'm glad you're bringing that up.
I'd actually love to continue our dialogue, but we must exit the theater by 3 so that the people for the film series can set up. So I would invite people to come and talk to our panelists afterwards. Maybe we can move down into the lobby if people are still willing to have a little bit of discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for coming.